Okay, moving along with René Girard, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. We are on the third chapter, which is the last chapter in part one. Part one is entitled Biblical Knowledge, the Biblical Knowledge of Violence. First chapter was Scandal Must Come. Second chapter was the Cycle of Mimetic Violence, which really went into detail of this cycle of rivalry and mimesis that eventually leads to violence, which is overcome in the society, or has been overcome through the history of civilizations, through the outlining of a scapegoat and the sacrifice of a scapegoat, which brings order again to a society, at least temporarily. The third section, the third chapter, is entitled Satan. And it's going to talk about how this process of mimetic violence is, it talked about a little before, that mimetic desire is not inherently bad, it's actually inherently good. What turns it into violence is the corruption, the scandal instantiated by essentially Satan and the way that he manipulates what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, doesn't create anything, but manipulates it in order to subvert it. And so chapter 3, I'm interested to get into it. It is about 13 pages, something like that. So we'll get started here. So chapter 3, Satan. Now I would like to confirm what I call the mimetic cycle in the Gospels. To do this, we have to turn to an idea, or rather a figure, that Christians today much disdain. The Gospels call him by his Hebrew name, Satan, or his Greek title, Diabolos, the devil. In a period when German theologian Rudolf Bultmann had such great influence, all the theologians who were up to date demythologized the scriptures with all their might, but they didn't even do the prince of this world the honor of demythologizing him. In spite of his considerable role in the Gospels, modern Christian theology scarcely takes him into account. If the Gospel reference to Satan are examined in light of the preceding analysis, then we see that they don't deserve the oblivion into which they have fallen. Like Jesus, Satan seeks to have others imitate him, but not in the same fashion and not for the same reasons. He wants first of all to seduce. Satan as seducer is the only way of his roles that the modern world condescends to remember a bit, primarily to joke about it. Satan likewise presents himself as a model for our desires, and he is certainly easier to imitate than Christ, for he counsels us to abandon ourselves to all our inclinations in defiance of morality and its prohibitions. If we listen to Satan, who may sound like a very progressive and likable educator, we may feel initially that we are liberated, but the impression does not last, because Satan deprives us of everything that protects us from rivalristic imitation. Rather than warning us of the trap that awaits us, Satan makes us fall into it. He applauds the idea that prohibitions are one of those or are of no use, and that transgressing them contains no danger. The road on which Satan starts us is broad and easy. It is the superhighway of mimetic crisis. But then suddenly there appears an unexpected obstacle between us and the object of our desire, and to our consternation, just when we thought we had left Satan far behind us, it is he or one of his surrogates who shows up to block the route. This is the first of many transformations of Satan. The seducer of the beginnings is transformed quickly into a forbidding adversary, an opponent more serious than all the prohibitions not yet transgressed. The secret of Satan's troublesome transformation is easy to discover. The second Satan is the conversion of the mimetic model into a rival. And this process, which was described in chapter 1, brings about scandals. Because our models suggest their own desires to us, they inevitably oppose the resulting desire. Once prohibitions are transgressed, another kind of obstacle rises up that is more tenacious still. though it is concealed at first by the very protection of the prohibitions offer, as long as they are respected. I am not the first or only one to relate Satan to scandals. The first was Jesus himself in the scathing rebuke to Peter, quote, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are a scandal to me," end quote. Peter becomes the object of this rebuke when he reacts negatively to the first prediction of the passion. Disappointed by what he takes to be the excessive resignation of Jesus, the disciple tries to breathe into him his own desire, his own worldly ambition. Peter invites Jesus, in short, to take Peter himself as the model of his desire. If Jesus were to turn away from his Father to follow Peter, he and Peter would both quickly fall into mimetic rivalry, and the venture of the kingdom of God would melt away in insignificant quarrels. Here Peter becomes the sower of scandals, the Satan who diverts human beings from God for the sake of rivalristic models. Satan sows the scandals and reaps the whirlwind of mimetic crisis. It is his opportunity to show what he is capable of doing. The great crises lead us to the true mystery of Satan, to add to his astonishing power, which is that of expelling himself and bringing order back into human communities. The main text on the subject of the satanic expulsion of Satan is the response of Jesus to scribes who accuse him of expelling Satan by Beelzebub, the prince of darkness. Quote from Mark Ch.3. "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, it cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, it cannot be maintained. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot endure and is finished." End quote. Accusing a rival exorcist of expelling demons by the power of Satan must have been a common accusation in that period. Many people must have repeated it mechanically. Jesus wants to make his hearers reflect on its implications. If it is true that Satan expels Satan, how does he go about it? How is this tour de force possible? Jesus does not deny the reality of Satan's self-expulsion. He asserts it. The proof that Satan possesses this power is the affirmation frequently repeated that this power is coming to an end. The imminent fall of Satan prophesied by Christ is one and the same thing as the end of his power of self-expulsion. The demonic or satanic expulsion of demons has worked previously, at least temporarily, because the violent outcomes of scandal, the violent expulsion of scapegoats, works for a while. In both Matthew and Mark, Jesus repeats the word Satan instead of replacing it with a pronoun. Jesus repeats the name, "How can Satan expel Satan?" Matthew changes the interrogative sentence of Mark into a conditional clause, but the basic formula does not change. If Satan expels Satan. The repetition of the word Satan is more eloquent than its replacement by a pronoun, but it is not a taste for fine language that inspires it. It is rather the desire to emphasize the fundamental paradox of Satan. He is a principle of order as much as disorder. The Satan expelled is the one who foments and exasperates mimetic rivalries to the point of transforming the community into a furnace of scandals. The Satan who expels is this same furnace who it reaches a point of incandescence is sufficient to set off the single victim mechanism. In order to prevent the destruction of his kingdom, Satan makes out of his disorder itself as, at its highest heat, a means of expelling himself. Because of this extraordinary power, Satan is the prince of this world. If he could not protect his domain from the violence that threatens to destroy it, even though it is essentially his own, he would not merit this title of prince, which the Gospels do not award him lightly. If he were purely a destroyer, Satan would have lost his domain a long time ago. To understand why he is this master of all the kingdoms and of this world, we must take Jesus at his word. Disorder expels disorder. Or in other words, Satan really expels Satan. By executing this extraordinary feat, he has been able to make himself indispensable, and so his power remains great. How do we comprehend this idea? Let's go back to the moment when the divided community at the height of the mimetic process reestablishes its unity against the single victim, who becomes the supreme scandal because everyone in a mimetic fervor holds this one to be guilty. Satan is the violent contagion that persuades the entire community, which has become unanimous, that this guilt is real. He owes one of his most ancient and traditional memes to this art of persuasion. He is the accuser of the hero in the book of Job before God, and even more so before the people. In transforming a community of people with distinct identities and roles into a hysterical mass, Satan produces myths and is the principle of systematic accusation that bursts forth from the contagious imitation provoked by scandals. Wow, what a sentence. I'm gonna repeat that one again here. In transforming a community of people with distinct identities and roles into a hysterical mass, Satan produces myths and is the principle of systematic accusation that bursts forth from the contagious imitation provoked by scandals. Once the unfortunate victim is completely isolated, deprived of defenders, nothing can protect him or her from the aroused crowd. Everyone can set upon the victim without having to fear at least reprisal. The victim may seem insignificant in relation to all the appetites for violence that are converging on him or her, but at this very moment, the community desires nothing other than the victim's destruction. The victim thus effectively replaces all those who were in conflict just a little earlier in the thousand scandals scattered here and there, and who now are all mustered against a single target. No one in the community has an enemy other than the victim. So once this person is hunted, expelled, and destroyed, the crowd finds itself emptied of hostility and without an enemy. Only one enemy was left, who has been eliminated. Provisionally, at least, this community is no longer experiences either hatred or resentment toward anyone or anything. It feels purified of all its tensions, of all its divisions, of everything fragmented in it. Everything fragmented it. The persecutors don't know that their sudden harmony, like their previous discord, is the work of contagious imitation. They believe they have on their hands a dangerous person, someone evil of whom they must rid the community. What could be more sincere than their hatred? Thus, the mimetic ganging up of all against one, or the single victim mechanism, has the amazing but logically explicable property of restoring calm to a community so disturbed an instant earlier that nothing appeared capable of calming it down. To apprehend this mechanism as the work of Satan is to understand that what Jesus asserts, Satan expels Satan, has a precise meaning rationally explainable. It defines the effectiveness of the single victim mechanism. The high priest Caiaphas alludes to the mechanism when he says, quote, "It is better that one man die and that the whole nation not perish." It is better that one man die and the whole nation not perish, end quote. The four accounts of the crucifixion thus enables us to witness the unfolding of the working of the single victim mechanism. The sequence of events, as I have already said, resembles numerous analogous phenomena whose director and producer is Satan. The proof that the cross and the mechanism of Satan are one and the same thing is given by Jesus himself when he says just before his arrest, quote, "This is your hour and the power of darkness," end quote. This hour, the moment of the power of darkness, is the hour of Satan. Jesus' statement is not a rhetorical formula, a picturesque way of suggesting the reprehensible character of what his persecutors are going to do to him. Like all the other gospel statements on the subject of Satan, this one has a precise and even technical meaning. It is one of the statements that designate the crucifixion as a working of the single victim mechanism. The crucifixion is one of those events in which Satan restores and consolidates his power over human beings. The shift from all against all to all against one permits the prince of this world to forestall the total destruction of his kingdom as he calms the anger of the crowd, restoring the calm that is indispensable to the survival of every human community. Satan can therefore always put enough order back into the world to prevent the total destruction of what he possesses without depriving himself for too long of his favorite pastime, which is to sow disorder, violence, and misfortune among his subjects. The death of Jesus thwarts the satanic calculation. We will soon see why, but initially it does indeed have the effects that we would expect of the one who set it into motion. We can verify from the Gospels that Jesus' death has the pacifying effect that Pilate, just like Satan, expects of it. The outcome is quite favorable from the point of view of the Pax Romana, of which Pilate is the guardian. The procurator feared a riot, but owing to the crucifixion, it did not occur. The torture of a victim transforms the dangerous crowd into a public of ancient theater or of modern film, as captivated by the bloody spectacle as our contemporaries are by the horrors of Hollywood. When the spectators are satiated with that violence that Aristotle calls cathartic, whether real or imaginary, it matters little. They all return peaceably to their homes to sleep the sleep of the just. The word catharsis designated, first of all, the purification that the spilled blood procures in ritual sacrifices, which are deliberate repetitions of the process described in the Passion. In other words, it is the satanic mechanism at work. This mechanism is also presupposed in the phenomenon of exorcism, which is the subject in the debate that gives Jesus the occasion to raise the question about the satanic expulsion of Satan. The Gospels enable us to see that human communities are subject to disorders that recur periodically and that can be resolved by the phenomenon of the unanimous crowd when certain conditions are satisfied. Such a resolution is rooted in mimetic desire and the scandals that always make human communities break down. The mimetic cycle begins with desire and its rivalries. It continues through the multiplication of scandals and a mimetic crisis, and is resolved finally in the single victim mechanism, which is the answer to the question asked by Jesus: how can Satan expel Satan? Certain medieval legends and traditional tales contain echoes of the gospel concept of Satan. We see in these a kindly, generous man, always ready to lavish benefits on people for little in return, or so it seems. His only request is that one soul, only one, be reserved for him. Sometimes it is the daughter of the king whom he demands, but it doesn't really matter who it is. Anyone will do just as well as the most beautiful of princesses. The demand appears modest, almost minute in comparison to the promised benefits, but the mysterious gentleman will not give it up. If it is not satisfied, all the gifts of the generous benefactor instantaneously vanish, and he vanishes with them. He is none other than Satan, of course, and to put him to flight, it suffices not to give in to his blackmail. In this sort of tale, there is a clear enough allusion to the prevailing power of the single victim mechanism in pagan societies and its perpetuation in veiled forms, often attenuated in Christian societies. One can see in all this an anthropology of mimetic desire, that is, an anthropology of crisis that stem from mimetic rivalry and of crowd phenomena, which end these crises in triggering a new mimetic cycle. Such an anthropology is found in the Gospel of John. In one of the discourses that he ascribes to Jesus, John inserts a short speech of 15 verses. Though in it we will find all the way we analyzed in the synoptic Gospels, its form is so elliptical and condensed that it occasions even more misunderstanding than the Gospel statements that I have just examined. In spite of differences of vocabulary which make it appear more difficult, the Johannine doctrine is the same as that of the synoptics. Our contemporaries often condemn the text of John as superstitious and vindictive. What John does, however, is to define anew, abruptly indeed, but also without hostility, the consequences for human beings of rivalristic imitation. In this discourse, Jesus enters into dialogue with some people who will soon abandon him because they do not understand his teaching. Many of the first followers who listen to Jesus are already scandalized. Quote, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded and came forth from God. I did not come forth of my own accord, but he himself sent me. Why don't you understand what I'm saying? It is because you are unable to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and it is the desires of your father that you wish to do. From the beginning, he was a murderer and had nothing to do with the truth because the truth is not in him. When he speaks lies, he draws them from his own nature because he is a liar and the father of lies. It's from John chapter 8, 42 to 44. Jesus tells these people who still think of themselves as his disciples that their father is neither Abraham nor God, as they avow, but the devil. The reason for this judgment? These people have the devil for a father because it is the desires of the devil that they want to fulfill, and not the desires of God. They take the devil as the model for their desires. The desire of which Jesus speaks is therefore based on imitation, whether of the devil or of God. What our text is talking about is mimetic desire in the sense already defined. To repeat, the idea of father is here the same thing as the model without which human desire, lacking its own proper object, cannot come into being. God and Satan are the two supreme models, the arch models, whose opposition to one another corresponds to what I have already described. One between models who never become obstacles and rivals for their disciples because they desire nothing in a greedy and competitive way, and models whose greed for whatever they desire has immediate repercussions on their imitators, transforming them right away into diabolical obstacles. The first verse of our text are therefore an explicitly mimetic definition of desire and of the options for the human race that stem from it. In the models that humans choose do not orient them in the right direction. If the models that humans choose do not orient them in the right direction, one without conflict through Christ as intermediary, they expose themselves eventually to violent loss of differences and identity, and thus to the single victim mechanism. And it is just here that we find the devil in the text of John. The sons of the devil are those who let themselves be taken into the circle of rivalristic desire and who unknowingly become the playthings of mimetic violence. Like all the victims of this process, they do not know what they are doing. If we do not imitate Jesus, our models become the living obstacles that we also become for them. We descend together on the infernal spiral that leads to generalized mimetic crisis and ultimately to the mimetic state of all against one. This inevitable consequence explains the apparent inexplicable shift of theme, the sudden allusion to collective murder. From the beginning, the devil was a murderer. If readers do not find the mimetic cycle here, again, it is because they do not understand it. They have the impression of an arbitrary, inexplicable rupture between this sentence and those that precede it. In reality, the succession of themes is perfectly logical, corresponding to the stages of the mimetic cycle. John attributes the mimetic all against one to the devil because he already views him as the source of the desire responsible for scandals. He could just as well attribute the whole process to humans, and occasionally he does. The text from John is a new definition, ultra rapid but complete, of the mimetic cycle. In us and about us, scandals proliferate. Sooner or later, they carry us along toward mimetic snowballing and the single victim mechanism. It makes us unknowingly the accomplices of unanimous murders. All the more deceived by the devil because we are not aware of our own complicity, which is not conscious of itself. We continue to imagine ourselves alien to all violence. From time to time, people go all the way in accomplishing the desires of their satanic father and fall back into the single victim mechanism. At the moment when Jesus speaks the word on which we are commenting, the mechanism that formerly mobilized the Canaanites against Abel and subsequently thousands of crowds against thousands of single victims is at the point of being repeated against him. Immediately after these fundamental assertions, our text states that the devil has nothing to do with the truth. What makes him our prince, our father, is false accusation, unjust condemnation of an innocent victim. It is not based on anything real or objective, but it succeeds no less in making itself unanimously convincing by virtue of violent contagion. The primary meaning of Satan in the Bible, we may recall, is the meaning found in the book of Job, the chief prosecuting magistrate, the prosecutor in a case at court. The devil is obviously untruthful, for if the persecutors understood the truth, the innocence of their victim, they could no longer get rid of their own violence at this victim's expense. The single victim mechanism only functions by means of the ignorance of those who keep it working. They believe they are supporting the truth when they are really living a lie. The devil's quintessential being, the source from which he draws his lies, is the violent contagion that has no substance to it. The devil does not have a stable foundation. He has no being at all. To clothe himself in the semblance of being, he must act as a parasite on God's creatures. He is totally mimetic, which amounts to saying non-existent as an individual self. The devil is also the father of lies. In certain manuscripts, he is the father of liars, because his deceitful violence has repercussions for generation after generation in human cultures. These cultures remain dependent on their founding murders and the rituals that reproduce them. The Gospel of John scandalizes those who do not detect in it the choice it multiplies. The people to whom Jesus was speaking did not detect it either. Many people believe they are faithful to Jesus, and yet they address superficial reproaches to the Gospels. This shows that they remain subject to mimetic rivalries and their violent one-upmanship. If we don't see that the choice is inevitable between the two supreme models, God and the devil, then we have already chosen the devil in his mimetic violence. Our righteous indignation against John's gospel has no basis. Jesus speaks the truth to his questioners. They have chosen rivalristic desire, and the long-term consequences will be disastrous. The fact that these people are Jews is much less important than those exegetes that are a little too eager to convict the Gospels of anti-Semitism. After its mimetic definition of desire, the Gospel of John makes the consequences of this desire explicit: satanic murder. The impression that Christian animosity toward the Jews produced in the text is due to our misunderstanding of its context, so we imagine a series of gratuitous insults. This effect of our ignorance is often compounded by a preconceived hostility towards the gospel message. We project our own resentment upon Christianity. John is talking to all humankind, not just to the Jews immediately addressed. This is usually the case in all the Gospels. The devil, or Satan, signifies rivalistic contagion up to the including the single victim mechanism. He may be located either in the entire process or in one of its stages. Modern exegetes don't not recognize the mimetic cycle have the impression that since the word Satan means so many different things, it no longer means anything. This impression is deceptive. If we take up one by one the propositions I have analyzed, we easily see that this teaching is coherent. Far from being too absurd to deserve our attention, this gospel theme contains incomparable knowledge of human conflict and the societies that are generated by the violent resolution of such conflict. Everything I have said about Satan corresponds to what the prior analysis of scandals enable us to understand. When the trouble caused by Satan becomes too great, Satan himself becomes his own antidote of sorts. He stirs up the mimetic snowballing and then the unanimous violence that makes everything peaceful once again. The great parable of the murderous vine growers, Matthew 21:33-41, brings out clearly the mimetic or satanic cycle. Each time the owners sends a messenger to the vine growers, this message sets in motion a crisis among them, which they resolve by ganging up against the messenger and expelling him. This unanimous agreement is the height of the mimetic snowballing. Each violent expulsion is the completion of a mimetic cycle. The last messenger is the son, expelled just like all the preceding messengers, and finally murder. This parable confirms my definition of the crucifixion. Jesus' death is one example among many others of the single victim mechanism. What makes the mimetic cycle of Jesus' suffering unique is not the violence, but the fact that the victim is the Son of God, which is certainly the main thing from the standpoint of our redemption. However, if we neglect the anthropological substructure of the Passion, we will miss the true theology of the Incarnation, which makes little sense without the anthropological basis. The concepts of the mimetic cycle and the single victim mechanism give specific content to an idea of Simone Weil. She held that even before presenting a theory of God, a theology, the Gospels offer a theory of man, an anthropology. Since it takes complete chaos in the community to set off the single victim mechanism, the Satan who expels and reestablishes order is really identical to the Satan who foments the disorder. Jesus' statement, Satan expels Satan, is irreplaceable. What is the cure-all of the prince of this world, his most clever trick, perhaps his only resource? It is the mimetic all against one of a single victim mechanism, is it the mimetic all against one or single victim mechanism? It is the mimetic unanimity that, at the highest pitch of disorder, brings order back into human communities. The sleight of hand remained hidden until the Jewish and Christian revelation. In fact, it has, to an extent, remained hidden after the Christian revelation up to our own time, since it remains almost universally misunderstood. Thanks to the deception, human communities are indebted to Satan for the shaky relative order that they enjoy. They are thus always in his debt and cannot free themselves on their own. What a great point that is. Satan imitates the same model as Jesus, God himself, but in a spirit of arrogance and rivalry for power. Satan has succeeded in perpetuating his own satanic kingdom for the better part of human history, thanks to God's forbearance. However, the mission of Jesus among human beings marks the beginning of the end for the prince of this world. The kingdom of Satan corresponds to a part of human history that precedes the death of the resurrection of Christ. Almost entirely governed by a single victim mechanism and the false religions it produces. The mimetic concept of Satan enables the New Testament to give evil its due without granting it any reality or ontological substance in its own right that would make of Satan a kind of god of evil. Satan does not create by his own means. Rather, he sustains himself as a parasite on what God creates by imitating God in a manner that is jealous, grotesque, perverse, and as contrary as possible to the upright and obedient imitation of Jesus. To repeat, Satan is an imitator in the rivalristic sense of the word. His kingdom is a caricature of the kingdom of God. Satan is the ape of God. To affirm that Satan has no actual being, as Christian theology has done, means that Christianity does not oblige us to see him as someone who really exists. The interpretation that assimilates Satan to rivalristic contagion and its consequences enables us for the first time to acknowledge the importance of the prince of this world without also endowing him with a personal being. Traditional theology has rightly refused to do the latter. In the Gospels, we found mimetic and victimary phenomenon are organized around two different concepts. The first is the impersonal principle, scandal. The second is the mysterious figure that the Gospels call Satan or the devil. As we have seen, the Synoptic Gospels contain a discourse of Jesus on scandal, but no discourse on Satan. The Gospel of John, on the other hand, includes no discourse on scandal, but includes one on the devil, which we have just examined. Scandals and Satan are fundamentally the same thing. However, we can observe two important differences between them. The primary emphasis in the two concepts shifts significantly. The accent in scandal is on the early stages of the mimetic process, consequently on relations between individuals rather than on collective phenomenon, although the latter are not absent, as already noted. The mimetic cycle is foreshadowed, but it does not take such clear form as in the case of the figure of Satan or the devil. The single victim mechanism is suggested, but not clearly set forth. With scandals as our single starting point, it would be difficult, I think, to arrive at a complete explanation of the single victim mechanism and the anthropological meaning of the cross. Yet this is what Paul does when he defines the cross as the supreme scandal. If we could not return to the pattern of the mimetic cycle to interpret it, Paul's message would remain partially unintelligible. Most readers do not really understand what Paul means. But with the satanic expulsion of Satan, the mimetic cycle is really closed, and the knot is really tied, for the single mechanism becomes explicitly defined. But why doesn't Satan present himself as an impersonal principle in the same way as the scandals? Because he designates the principal consequence of the single victim mechanism, the emergence of the false transcendence and the numerous deities that represent it. Satan is always someone. That is what the following chapters should enable us to understand. So that is the end of part 1. and we'll continue next time. Thanks.